Good morning, everybody. Final morning of our Coming Up Together conference. It's hard to believe. How's everyone doing this morning? Hooray! I've got a long list of announcements. I'm going to get started on announcements while our morning panel sets up. First of all, show of hands, how many people were at the musical showcase last night? Okay, the rest of you missed out. Oh my God, it was amazing. It was amazing. Highlights, the whole room singing Hallelujah together because the sound cut out. The one performer who had us all singing the line from his song, which goes, excuse me, I'm going to swear, there goes my holy fuck. And then all of us were singing. It was amazing. Really, really, really phenomenal, talented. Corinne did an incredible job organizing and moderating and pulling it all together. So, fabulous, fabulous event. Some announcements. This afternoon, I think you know that we're having an incredible session. It's called Where Do We Go From Here? And we've moved it. It's going to be here in this room in 4007. We think that'll work. We did have it downstairs in a larger auditorium, but it's going to be here. To prepare for that, there is a policy document that's called, well, I don't know if policy document's the right word. It's called Opportunity Knocks, Prioritizing Canada's Most Vulnerable Youth. You may have picked up a copy. It's out on the registration table. Pick up a copy if you have chance to peruse it in advance of the session. That'll help you prepare a bit. Don't worry if you don't have time. That's fine. You can take it with you. If you have luggage, because I know a lot of people are flying out today, if you're carrying around your luggage, we do have, we have a volunteer headquarters where there's always a person staying to watch the volunteers' coats and bags. So if you want to leave your luggage there, you're welcome to do so. It is in FSS 4012, down at the end of the hallway, 4012. Okay, so you can drop off your luggage there. You may have noticed there's a petition on the registration desk, Housing as a Human Right, that was initiated by people who are attending the conference. If you'd like to sign that, that's there. The memorial flags, where we moved the winter clothing and the art show, it's been an amazing hub for people to go to. And we only had that room where we've been doing it until 1 p.m. today. And so we decided we would move it to a room we have all day. And so we've moved it over to 4014, which is just around the corner again. So please continue to visit that room. You can make more of the spirit flags, or if you want to pick up some winter clothing, the walking tours are happening at lunch, and it's cold out. It's actually cold out today. It's actual Ottawa February authentic winter experience. So you can pick up some winter clothing for your walking tour if you just need it for being in Ottawa this afternoon or this evening. And you can also look at the art. You could buy some art. Some of the pieces have sold already. It's fabulous. Remind you, all proceeds go back to the artists themselves. Sign up for walking tours. The walking tours are going to be incredible, and they're led by members of our youth team, and the sign-up sheets are only half full. I'm really surprised by this. So do sign up, or if you just want to show up at lunch, it looks like there'll be space. They're going to be meeting at 12:15 right at the registration desk, and you can join a member of our youth team. We have 4 or 5 different tours happening, and they'll take you for a walk around this part of the city and give you a little taste of what it's like to try and survive in Ottawa when you're homeless and young. The memorial, coming back to the memorial. I mentioned yesterday that on a piece of the design of the memorial that was developed by members of our youth team and Kathy Edwards, who's been supporting them, are these friendship pins that people can take in order to wear and help sort of bring out into the world the memory of the person that commemorates. So Kath wants me to tell you that we want all of the pins gone by the end of the day, that those pins are meant to go out into the world. And so please take some time to look at the flags. They're up above on the windows above the food table, and you can take a pin and wear it out into the world and remind yourself and remind the world of how important this is. And we have some other announcements in relation to the memorial, which, thank you, Ruth is going to come up and offer, and then I'm going to come back for one more thing. But one more announcement before Ruth is we have some extra water bottles, the Coming Up Together blue water bottles. So if you'd like to grab one or grab one for a friend. You should take them. Sorry, 2 more announcements. Sorry, Ruth. I have a really long list today. Elections Canada are here, and they've set up a ballot box, which is out on the registration table, which is not for voting today. It's for leaving your information if you have questions. They're developing programs to try and support homeless young people to vote. Super important. Anyone who works in the sector knows that homeless youth don't vote, but their voice counts. And so if you want to leave your card or a question or your name and get more information, if you're a service provider, if you're a young person, you can leave that in the ballot box. I think those are all my general announcements. I'm going to get Ruth up here, and then I'm going to come back.
I'm going to use the stairs. I thought about lunging, but I saw that go well last night. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to start off by saying a huge thank you for all of your work yesterday around food waste. We were able to collect so much food, and we'll enjoy it today if you want it. So I'm part of the Community Engaged Sociology course at Carleton University, and this is my 2nd term in the course. What we do is we go out and we take our learning and put it into action. Last term, we partnered with Away Home Ottawa around the Housing Locator program here in Ottawa. And this term, what we're doing is we are launching the Memorial Spirit Flags. And what that looks like is inviting members of the community to come in and recognize and honor and memorialize those youth who have lost their lives as a result of homelessness. But we also want to give the Memorial Spirit Flags life. So I have 2 things. 1, if you're in or near Ottawa, on March 15th, we'll be launching the Spirit Flags, and we invite you to come join us. Our event will be held at Makerspace North, but if you'd like more details, you can look us up. It's Coming Up Ottawa on Facebook, on Twitter. We have an Eventbrite page. There are all these things I didn't know you could do to get people to come to an event. Skills. The second thing that I wanted to mention is, and this is especially to the youth who are in attendance, but also to service providers, please come and see myself or Kathy over in the Memorial Spirit Flag room. I think that was 4014. If you or your community or your organization would like to have the Memorial Spirit Flags travel to your community, this is something that I think is really important and continues those conversations, but it also brings us together. So if you're interested, if you have just an idea, come talk to me. I'm here all day. And enjoy the last day of the conference. Thank you.
Okay, so before I turn it over to our opening panel, which is going to be a fabulous panel discussion on prevention, there are some very important people who need to be acknowledged and thanked for all of the amazing work that has gone into this conference. So I'm going to start by calling up the members of my planning team, Kevin, Cora, Kath, Alex, Warren, and Genevieve, and not everyone's going to be here because they're also all busy doing stuff, but everyone who's here, if you're able to come up to the front. This is my group, mostly, except for Kath, mostly my graduate students. Kath joined us, November, but she's been absolutely invaluable. She's a staff at Carleton University. And these are the people who have made all of this happen, who have ordered the food, who have created the programs, who have put together the plenaries. Really phenomenal. Thank you. Another incredibly important group of people who have made this event what it is: Charlotte, Cindy, Aya, Tiffany, Corinne, Stu, and Holly. And I know you're not all here, but if you are here, can you come to the front? It's our youth team. So the youth team are the ones who initiated the Memorial Spirit Flags, the art show, the musical showcase, planned the youth workshops, the youth stream, probably other things I'm forgetting. Really amazing. And last but not least, super important, quietly working in the background, making all of this flow as smoothly as it has, much to my amazement, I gotta say, because we just had no idea what we were doing. Our volunteers are all standing at the back. Lots of students from Carleton and U of O. And thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, without further ado, I am going to pass the mic over to Kristen Holinsky, who is the Executive Director of the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa and a member of our steering committee for the Coming Up Together conference, and she is going to introduce the panel.
Well, hello everybody. How are you guys doing today? You ready for this panel? Yeah, okay. So I've been given the delightful task of introducing this amazing panel, which is going to be discussing a youth homelessness prevention roadmap. And so communities across Canada are recognizing that we really need to do more than just manage the problem of youth homelessness, that while communities have been moving forward in the direction of supporting chronically homeless people to exit homelessness through housing first, we need to do more. We need to be paying attention to the prevention side of the problem as well. So the Youth Homelessness Prevention Roadmap's designed to help provide a conceptual framing for the prevention of youth homelessness, but also draws on international and local examples to show how this can be done. This panel begins by highlighting results of consultations with youth with lived experience, and then provides practical strategies on prevention for communities of every size, couching these interventions in systems planning. So the panel ends with a practical case study of what a shift to prevention looks like at the community level. And so to present all this to you, we have these 4 fantastic panelists, and I would like to introduce them to you. So we first have here, on my left, Corinne Sauvé. Corinne is the Youth Liaison and co-chair of Away Home Ottawa, a research assistant with Making the Shift with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and a community member on the Research and Evaluation Working Group with the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa. That's a lot of things that you do, Corinne. Corinne's lived experience of homelessness as a youth is what drives her to engage in this field. She's been working as a youth liaison and peer researcher for Away Home Ottawa since 2016, where she's had the chance to collaborate on 2 community consultations. She's also been involved in the Youth Stream Planning Committee of this conference and has recently been hired as a research assistant with Making the Shift. In the past, she's worked as a peer supporter at the Youth Services Bureau of Ottawa and collaborated as a peer researcher on the Sex Work Safety and Housing Study led by the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa. So welcome. And we have next to Corinne, Dr. Stephen Gates, who is a leading international researcher on homelessness and is director of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness at York University. He focuses his efforts on conducting research and mobilizing this knowledge so as to have a greater impact on solutions to homelessness. And Stephen plays a leading international role in knowledge dissemination of homelessness research through the Homeless Hub. And beside him, we have Melanie Redman, who's the executive director of Away Home, working together to end youth homelessness in Canada. And prior to that, Melanie was the director of national initiatives at EVAS, and in that role, she directed the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness, the EVAS Awards for Ending Youth Homelessness, and the Mobilizing Local Capacity to End Youth Homelessness program, which works with communities across Canada to implement and sustain plans to end youth homelessness. She currently serves as the chair of Youth Homelessness Research Priority Area at the Canadian Observatory of Homelessness and is also the chair of the board of the Rainbow Food Education Foundation. And last but not least, we have Mike Lethby. Mike is currently executive director of the Niagara Resource Services for Youth, or the RAFT. It's a nonprofit agency in the Niagara region working with at-risk youth and their families. Mike's an innovative leader. He's working to create a systemic approach to addressing youth issues in the region, and he's moving the region's youth services model from a reactive institutional crisis model to a preventative community model. Mike's overseen the development and implementation of Youth Reconnect, which is a school homelessness prevention initiative, and Internal Roots, which deals with kinship finding and connections. And he's also launching Niagara's Housing First Youth Response. He's currently working with the province of Ontario as well to launch a social impact bond to support the scaling of RAFT's Youth Reconnect program to neighborhood and communities. So with this amazing panel, I turn it over to you, and we'll have some Q&A following.
Good morning, everyone. Bon matin, tout le monde. As Kristen has said, my name is Corinne Sauvé. I'm very happy to be here. Prevention is an exciting topic. As you've heard, I have lived experience of homelessness, and this is in part what I will draw from to explain what I believe is missing on the prevention side of things. I will also draw from 2 community consultations that I've been a part of conducting with Away Home Ottawa. The first one, that was like 2 years ago, and I was a peer researcher, so I was one of the people asking the questions to other youth in the community. And the second one, the most recent one, I was not a peer researcher. I had the chance to, along with other people, pull all the data together, read through the transcripts, and try to find common themes and write the actual report, which I think it's out on the front. If there are still some printed copies, but it will be online at some point. The first one is called the Opportunity Project, and is housed on the Alliance to End Homelessness website. There's the Away Home Ottawa, category in that website. Great. So, what could have prevented the experiences of youth homelessness? Of the youth that have been consulted, of the youth that I personally know, and of myself personally also. None of what I'm gonna say is groundbreaking. I'm sorry. Like, a lot of this is common sense, but our system isn't common sense. It's not what it relies on. So I'm gonna highlight a few things, and whatever's missing out, I'm sure these three amazing professionals will fill in. So one of the things that has been missing is school-based interventions. A lot of the youth we spoke to talked about being in school, showing some signs and symptoms of homelessness or at risk of homelessness, and no protocols were in place to help them. There was no protocol, no clear intervention path was in place for these sometimes amazing teachers and counselors who would go out of their way to try to navigate the absence of protocol to help the young person. But we cannot solely rely on amazing human beings. We need to have something in place, that directs us. So that is one thing about schools that youth have highlighted. And then youth got really creative when asked, what could have been different to help their experience, to help them not go into homelessness. One of the things is some programming in schools that would be peer-led and that would educate folks on what resources are available in the community. What is homelessness? What services are out there? And when I say what is homelessness, I say this because through consulting with youth and just through my own experience, couch surfing and just precarious housing and survival sex work and all these things are not often viewed as homelessness from people who experience it firsthand. So, they will kind of exclude themselves from the conversation and remain in that invisible homelessness category, which is like uncounted for. And really hard to get to. Education in schools, ideally done by peers, some people with lived experience, and hopefully that would be a part of the curriculum. So these are a few of the innovative ideas that youth have had. Another one is community-based conversations. Perhaps especially for communities in which there is more stigma. This one young lady, Muslim young lady, suggested that some conversation could be started in halal food stores, amongst communities. Also, family-based interventions, no surprise there. And I mean, before I go into that, I just want to highlight the Upstream Project. Is coming to Ottawa. Yay! So for those of you who don't know, the Upstream Project is it's an assessment tool that will go to schools, and it assesses on various various things that can point to homelessness or being at risk of homelessness. So we can kind of catch youth who are not helped, who don't show all the apparent symptoms, and link them to a case manager and to the appropriate services before they end up homeless. So it's had some success elsewhere, and we're starting with a pilot. The CIPEO, the Conseil. That was my school council. I should know this. The school board, the French Public School Board. Has it's gone through ethics. They're up for it. They're the first official one, and we're working on the three others with Away Home Ottawa. So that's great. On family-based interventions, so no surprise there. Family conflict, violence, it's a main cause for youth entering homelessness. And sometimes there is some work to be done there. Sometimes the families just, you know, if it's extreme transphobia or homophobia, I'm not one to say let's fix and patch up that family. Often these young people have expressed the need to find a new family and redefine what family means to them. That's perfectly fine, honestly. But for those where there can be a reconnection, I think there's some interesting work being done with Youth Reconnect right now that responds to what I've heard in the conversations I've had with youth. Definitely for newcomer youth, that was a big theme too. Sometimes some intergenerational disagreements happened with culture. You know, if the parent has immigrated and the youth were really young, then the young person has gotten used to two kind of cultures and negotiates between those two. And sometimes, you know, problems arise that are quite solvable if interventions are there to help mediate and make those conversations happen. Now, this is the next thing I'm going to talk about. Prevention side is a pretty tricky one. Our second research focused on the second phase of our consultation, should I say, focused on specific identities and that were overrepresented in youth homelessness. That perhaps needed specific kind of solutions, and so that was Indigenous youth, LGBTQ2S youth, as well as newcomer youth. And so I spoke a bit about LGBTQ2S youth as well as newcomer youth, but now I'm going to speak about Indigenous youth. This is, for me, like I wasn't as educated as I should have been, and like quite sadly, prevention on this end looks a lot like what could have prevented a lot of these youth experiences of homelessness. Would have been like the absence of colonial bullshit, okay? Like, had the 60s scoop not happened, had the residential schools not happened, had the, you know, displacement and relocation and abuse and, you know, loss of culture and language and just violence, had this not happened, I don't think we would have the problem, you know, we face today. And these communities are extremely resilient, and they find home not solely in a physical place where, you know, where we Western people think it is. And for that, I will point to Jesse Thistle's definition of Indigenous homelessness. It's an extremely important piece of work. So if you don't know this, go ahead and find it. Definitely a lot of answers are there. And so prevention on this end is maybe to look at what is still ongoing about this colonial bullshit. I'm just gonna call it what it is, because it's still happening in different ways. Sometimes not as overt as it was in like the 60s, but it's definitely still happening. Like Ottawa's like the largest urban center getting Inuit youth in, and what happens when they get to Ottawa? They go to the Sheps. So I am not an expert on this process, but that's kind of nuts. You know, CAS takes Indigenous youth at like crazy proportions. Meanwhile, reserve housing is underfunded. So what's happening here? You are chronically underfunding housing for Indigenous peoples, yet taking the youth from these reserves into child services, in part because of inadequate housing situation and overcrowding. That is one of the reasons why they take youth. So where do you put the money? Do you put the money in the white families that will take in Indigenous youth again, or do you just fund Indigenous housing? I mean, that's a pretty easy switch to make. Next. Sorry. I mean, ultimate system prevention would look like providing equal access to opportunities so that no group becomes at higher risk due to poverty, violence, intergenerational trauma, racism, etc. Some policy adjustments also need to be made. So to avoid creating homelessness, maybe look at how you discharge people out of institutions, jails, CAS. Some of these places are, like I've heard before, highways to homelessness. And avoid unnecessary loss of rent income. So I'm thinking here specifically about OW regulations, which have been so mentioned in the consultations. So Ontario Works is our social assistance system here in Ontario. And there are rules that you have to follow and hoops you need to jump through in order to get your money, which pays for your rent. So like, let's say you miss an appointment or you forgot to scan this form, because of course you have a scanner in your pocket. Or you're between 16 and 17 and you need to prove that you're not welcome back home. So like your parents actually have to vouch for you and say, no, they're not welcome home. Right? And a lot of these youth, they're leaving like violent, unsafe situations. Like, you know, like I've had like a lot of stories of transphobic parents, quite sadly, who now like on the spot, on the phone would say, yeah, no, of course they're welcome back, you know, but they kicked them out when they came out, right? And so that just gives a lot of trouble to youth. That's just putting conditions to housing, which we know now is a basic human right. So having a rights-based approach inform policy and service would make quite a bit of difference on the prevention side. Lastly, this is my last point. Community integration, which is one of the Housing First principles, has been mentioned explicitly or implicitly by several youth who feel lonely, who feel different. And that's important because even when youth are housed, they can bounce back into homelessness quite easily, quite fast, quite scarily, and sometimes chronically, if they are not integrated into their communities, if there is no peer network there, you know, if they are only a number and only receive services from professionals, somehow we're missing a part of what will help sustain safe and healthy transitions into adulthood. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. That was great and great setup. It's as if we all talked beforehand, which we did actually. But how long do we have to go? Because I need to know how fast I should talk. And I've had a lot of coffee, so I can. 10 minutes. I'm going to translate that with the exchange rate. That's 17 minutes. Okay, let's go. Okay, so the prevention as a concept around homelessness in North America has been absent from the conversation for decades, right? It's like, we'll get around to prevention once we house all people who are chronically homeless, which is kind of a backwards way of thinking. I think if we really want to address youth homelessness and do it in a way that honors the needs of young people and honors their rights, then we focus on prevention more than waiting for people to be homeless, to get really sick, to be exploited. It's an upside down system that we've created that we have to fix. The good news is that we know a lot about what to do. And so the first thing is to start with what young people have to say. And your comments were really good because you touched on a number of things that young people say. And we did a consultation where we released a report in the past month called What Would It Take? We talked to 114 young people, did a bunch of focus groups across Canada, and the results were very consistent with what you were saying, right? The key point, I think, is this, that we wait too long to help, right? We did a national youth survey a couple of years ago, and we found that over 40% of all currently homeless young people had their first experience before they were 16 years old. That means that they wouldn't be eligible because most communities don't have services until you're 16. But it also goes to your point that there probably was an adult in their life that knew something was wrong but didn't know what to do. We haven't created a system to do that work, so we need to get at that. So that report goes into a lot of detail about what young people think, and that should drive the way we think about stuff. And so what would it look like? Because it's one thing that, like to rally people around the idea of prevention, but what are we actually talking about? So let's go through this. We created a definition of the prevention of homelessness because if you don't define things clearly, then everything we do becomes the newest, fancy, shiny object. And the key with prevention of youth homelessness is it has to be housing-led. It either has to stop people from entering homelessness, or once they're housed again after they've been homeless, they don't become homeless again. It's not what happens while they are homeless, right? All of that work can be good, but it's not preventing homelessness, okay? Prevention is what we call a fusion policy issue, right? So it's going to involve the community, and Melanie's going to talk about this in much more detail, but it also involves all kinds of parts of government. We've kind of created this world where the homelessness sector is responsible for answering problems that are created by the education system, by healthcare, by child protection, all of these things. So we have to create an all-government kind of response to homelessness, to youth homelessness, if we really want to address it. And so in this roadmap document, which we are planning to release soon, I've stopped saying like the date because it's like, who knows? Hopefully within a month. How ambitious is that? I'm busy now. Okay, but what we did is we looked around the world to see where people are doing interesting prevention work. And there's good examples in Canada. I'm so glad that Mike's here to talk, because you've been a leader on that, right? And on making that shift. But elsewhere in the world, they've approached the problem differently. And so we've learned what to do, right? It's not like we have to scratch our heads and go, what should we do? Like the comments you had from young people give us a lot of direction, right? So number one is we have to work upstream to address structural factors, right? So it's not just the sector's responsibility to address the prevention of youth homelessness. So we need to look at poverty, lack of housing, colonization, that colonial bullshit we need to do. And in fact, a really effective prevention strategy would be an act of reconciliation, right? And so we need to think about that all the way through. Identify and address inequality and discrimination. And I go back to what Mary Birdsell said in the opening plenary. We have to really enact policies that enshrine the rights of children and youth. This is something Away Home's been saying for years now, but make it real, not just rhetoric. Make it real. Build the prevention responses around what young people have the right to, and have young people lead their own pathway forward, not just like impose upon them, here is what you get, right? We have to support young people exiting public systems. This is a huge problem, but it's one that we should be able to solve. In Canada, I think the figure is 0.3 of all young people are involved in child protection to some degree. With our national survey, we found that over 57% of all young people had a history of involvement in child protection. So there are failed transitions from care, right? We're not doing a good job of helping young people. If we take somebody into care, as a society, we're obligated to support them until they are adults, not until they're 18, not until they're 19, and then here's your clothes in a garbage bag, see you later, right? We have to support them. And it doesn't necessarily mean more group homes or more foster care, but we're obligated to help them. And there's good examples of how to do this from the UK and from Europe, where they're doing what's called an aftercare guarantee, where anybody taken into care has guaranteed rights, and there's a statutory responsibility to support young people when they leave. The third area is systems-based approach to early intervention. So getting at young people early on when they're 11, 12, 13, 14. What do we need to do? We need to create a system of care, right? Integrated system, you were talking about that. And then have program models that are going to help young people. Either help them return home if it's safe and appropriate to, and that may mean living with different family members even, or help them move into independent living that is safe and appropriate. Given the lack of time, I'm going to move to this quickly. We've identified 6 areas where early intervention needs to be built out more. And there's some good examples in Canada, there's some emerging examples, but elsewhere they're doing more work on this. The first is enhancing family and natural supports. You mentioned, You know, people can't be dependent on professional supports. That's the system we've created. A young person from a small town, couch surfs until they can't anymore, and then they wind up moving to the big city, and all their natural supports, their friends, their family, their teachers, their coaches, the neighbor down the street, all of these things disappear. And so we need to support this. And unfortunately, we've created a system that sometimes is geared to do the exact opposite. In a sense, when a young person leaves home, the family disappears, because we often frame the family as the problem, knowing that many young people are fleeing difficult family circumstances, and that family conflict is a big cause. But we don't need to think that way. We need to work differently on reconnecting young people to family and other natural supports. That issue around social inclusion is key to prevention. Helping young people find the connections, other young people and adults in their life, helping repair family relations, helping support families. Like sometimes it's not even family conflict that's at issue. It might be that the family itself is precariously housed, and you know, the parents are struggling. How do we support those families? That helps prevent youth homelessness. School-based early intervention. This is really key. In Australia, when their youth homelessness problem started to rise in the 1990s, they said, I don't think building emergency shelters and warehousing young people is really a good idea. Why don't we get into the schools, right? And so that's exactly what they did. And why do schools matter? It's exactly what you were saying, that, it's very likely when things started to go wrong for that young person, there's an adult in their life who knew it, a teacher or a coach or an instructor, counselor, but they don't know what to do, right? That's not they haven't been trained. They're not like given that knowledge. So schools matter, and the interventions in schools are many. You mentioned the education piece. That's really key, and I love the idea of it being peer-led. Teachers, students, families need to understand youth homelessness, its causes and conditions, but people also need to understand where they can get help. It's very rare that a 13-year-old would say, you know what I really need is family mediation support. I've been thinking about that since I was 7, right? And so people have to understand what is the nature of supports that can help. And so these kind of the best ones are school community partnerships. This isn't ladening schools with more things to do, because, then you get pushback. The Upstream project, which you mentioned, is a really interesting, it's kind of like the Australian Youth Homelessness Prevention 2.0. And it's a really amazing approach, evidence-based, right? It's in Australia, the research goes hand in hand with the work. They've had amazing outcomes, and it's now in Canada, and we're working towards pilots in 3 communities right now. And going further, we need to develop the evidence base in Canada to convince schools, but it works, right? These things work. Community-based early intervention. I'm not going to talk too long about this, except because Mike's going to talk about this and the system transformation. If ever you get a chance to hear Mike speak, it's great. It's like, he always makes a PowerPoint and then throws it away. Just, But it's really important, and this involves community agencies working not just in schools, but with community associations or wherever a young person might enter the picture, right? And providing them and their families supports. And the idea is that it's place-based. The idea is to help keep the young person in their community with their relationships and natural supports intact until the young person, if they want to move, and young people will maybe, but so that if they move, it's in a safe and planned way, not because they have to. So one last thing I want to mention is shelter diversion, right, which was on that list as well. There's some interesting experiments in Ontario, in Cambridge, where the youth shelters are now focusing on shelter diversion. Now, shelters are everything they do is geared towards intake. The young person shows up, and it's like, we sit down and talk with you. We've got a bed. We're going to bring you in. What they're doing is flipping it around and saying, when you come, we want to understand the problem and figure out how to keep you in your community and safe with the supports you need. So the goal isn't to draw more people in. It's to help you stay out of the shelter. Can you imagine that? The role of the shelter is to keep you out of the shelter. So housing stabilization, this is a big thing, because we know, I see, I'm going to call you Cov Naomi. That's your name. No, the research, Naomi Talon has done this amazing research with other people. The outcomes for young people, if we just get them housed, throw the keys through the mail slot and run away, the outcomes aren't good, right? People are often precariously housed. If they don't get back to school, their chance of getting a living income that's going to allow them to stay housed is there. The isolation is there. Often there are safety concerns, house takeovers, exploitation that happens. So we have to do a better job when young people get housed, whether it's through the early intervention prevention or once they exit, making sure they have the kind of supports they need. And the Housing First for Youth program model guide outlines a lot of like what this would mean in terms of the philosophy of Housing First, what the supports are, and again, it's much more than just getting you housed, right? And the good examples of it is helping young people get those connections, feel connected, and sticking with them, understanding they're young people, right? Like this, you know, a 1-year limit or 6-month limit for support. Like, would you do that with your 17-year-olds? Like, you've got 6 months, buddy. Get your shit together, because you're out, right? Like, so we need to like imagine like what we would need, right? And okay. And the final thing here is this. This is like an exciting new concept that we're trying to import from Wales, where they introduced national legislation, I think 2014, and it's homelessness prevention legislation. And enshrined in that is the notion of duty to assist, how you create a statutory responsibility to help young people if we know that they're at risk of or experience homelessness. And the help is not just to herd them into shelters. We have to help them. You're obliged to help them. You're obliged to help them and their family. And it's a rights-based approach, and it's a client-driven, a youth-driven approach. You work with the young person to identify what they need, and you move forward on that. The statutory responsibility is important, right? So that what it means is that the young person, if they present as homeless or at risk, if we do not help them, they have what's called a judiciable option, which is that they can sue the government, right? Which means they need Mary Birdsell and other lawyers, right? But it's to really put the pressure on the system. Now we can't get there overnight, right? Because if you have a duty to assist, you have to have the system of care in place and the services and supports and ideally rights-based approaches. And so, but here's how it would work, I think. Oh, okay. So we need to change our systems to get ready for something like this. But here's how it would work. So a young person could self-report and identify, right, if they were educated in school and knew that something like this existed. It's like, there's somewhere I can go for help. Adults, whether it's teachers, coaches, or the police or employment worker, then if they knew someone was at risk, would have a duty to report. There would be supports there, intake and assessment, and again, you build it around the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. And it's client-driven and rights-based. And so once the whole process then means that once somebody's identified as being in need of support, we are obliged to provide it to prevent their homelessness or to help them exit as quickly as possible. So this is an idea that I think is very radical in Canada. They've done it in Wales, and they've driven down the flow into homelessness, right? We need to stop looking just at American approaches, right, and understand that other countries are making progress in ways that are very rights-based and prevent homelessness. So now I'm going to hand it over to Melanie, and I think that only took like 6 minutes. So that was, yeah.
And as an American happy to be in Canada, I can say, yes, we shouldn't be looking at the American models of how to prevent homelessness. So how do we get there? Let's review. That's a lot of information, right? And a lot of, you're a badass, by the way, I love you. So we heard from youth with lived experience what would have prevented their experience of homelessness, and you can't deny that. We've heard, right? We also know that we have a language now of what is homelessness prevention, what it is not, and why that's really important. And then we also have examples of prevention program models at work. And so what else do we need? What's missing? I mean, you're probably feeling as a practitioner, as a policymaker, wow, it's a lot. I gotta do all this, but you don't have to do all of this alone. And so let's talk about that. Away Home Canada, we're a national coalition. There are a lot of local communities that have adopted the name as a way to say, we're gonna figure out prevention. We're gonna work together differently to make a difference in youth homelessness. So we work in areas of policy, planning, and practice in transforming how we respond to youth homelessness. One of the things that we support communities to do, and we're gonna be doing some of this work this afternoon in our facilitated session with all of you. We support communities to come up with a single voice. What do all the orders of government need to do in order to enable you at the community level to shift to prevention and sustained exits from homelessness? Another piece of the work that we do, and that's really critical to bring all of those interesting ideas and program models together, is develop targeted strategies to prevent and end youth homelessness. And so what needs to be in those strategies? We learned something really important from the Youth with Lived Experience in Ottawa a couple of years ago when they released their framework for a strategy to prevent and end youth homelessness, and Corinne was a huge part of this work. They said, you know what? The Housing First for Youth principles need to drive our entire system. So yeah, maybe you in your community, you don't have a Housing First for Youth program, but those principles can guide everything you do in rural, suburban, and urban areas. And so really think about that. What would that mean if your entire response from beginning to end was driven by those core principles? And really critical in all of this planning work is supporting our Indigenous partners to play the leadership role on preventing and ending Indigenous youth homelessness. And like Corinne said, we have to take a hard look at ourselves and what that means, right? And it's very uncomfortable. It's very difficult work, but it's the work that must happen and be at the core of everything we do. And one of the things that Steve and I talk about a lot in our work is how much we're learning from our Indigenous partners around how to make collective impact work. Where does it fall apart? Truth, humility, love, trust, courage. These are really important teachings that we need to infuse in all of our work. These community strategies have to be driven by prevention. When communities first started making plans to end homelessness, often we would analyze them, and they're mostly just re-articulations of what they're already doing. No vision for how to transform, to how to change, how to prevent. And key to all of this, and to go back to what Steve presented earlier, we've asked the youth-serving sector, the service providers, for far too long to bear the brunt of all of this. You're responsible for providing kick-ass services, and you're responsible for preventing and ending youth homelessness. Well, that's just crazy, right? So the systems that are part of driving young people into homelessness also must be part of the solution. And so all of that necessitates this thing called collective impact. And our friends from Kamloops and Kingston and communities across Canada that have been doing this systems planning and implementation work can tell you, this shit matters. Like, this is real, right? And this is hard. Bhavna, Catherine, is this hard? Is collective impact hard work? Anyone? Anyone else doing collective impact work? Is it hard? But it's the key, right? So working across the systems that drive young people into homelessness to be part of the solutions, and engaging unusual suspects and taking the weight off of the youth-serving sector to have to do everything. And so, yeah, you're not alone in this. And because we're in an Ontario-focused conference, I have a map of Ontario. That doesn't mean there aren't a lot of amazing individuals around the country doing this work. But so these are communities, and they keep adding. We haven't had a chance to update the slide. So if you don't see your community there and you're like, wait a second, we're doing systems planning work, blame Steve, because he made the slide. Blame Steve. That could be a motto. Blame Steve. Hashtag blame Steve, exactly. So all of these communities are engaged in some level of this work and are poised to do more. And our role as Away Home is to support communities to have the tools and resources they need to do that. Some of the things that we have, making the plan is actually the easy part. It's doing the hard work of putting that into action. It takes years. Our friends in Kingston, Bhavna will be on the closing panel later. Catherine from Kamloops will be speaking in a session after this one. And they can talk about this. This takes time. This work takes a lot of time. And especially if you're in a larger urban area, it's a more complex process. And if you're in a rural area, it's going to look completely different, and Mike's going to share some wisdom around that. But so these are some of the things we have to support you to do your work. And another thing that we're doing with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is to help build, because evidence actually matters, and I'm really happy that we finally have some orders of government that think that too. So we're working on this project, Making the Shift, and we have federal dollars to build the evidence base on models of prevention and housing first for youth. And that then gives you something that you can take to your funders, that you can take to orders of government to say, look, they've been doing this work. We've got some evidence that this works. This works. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mike now, because it's great for me to lay out systems planning and for Steve to lay out the framework, but it's really what Karen was saying and what Mike is going to tell you that matters. How do you put this to action at the community level, and what's that change management process look like?
Morning, everybody. So I'm going to basically share my prevention story with you. And so just something right off the top. This is my experience, and I can really only speak to how I interpreted the things that have occurred to me and the things I've been able to do from my own lens. So this might look very different from any one of you sitting in the audience. It probably would. So everything taken with a grain of salt. I'm also over 30, so you really can't trust me anyways. Right? So I started off as a relatively new executive director back in 2006. Actually hadn't worked in social services at all in my lifetime. I just went to school. I worked in a factory. The raft, I did some grant writing. I basically went to university, so I learned how to write, and then I could write grants, and then I was able to get money, and that made me very valuable for the not-for-profit sector. And the raft was really just, it was just going under. It was just a failed agency. No one wanted the job, so they gave me the job, which is great because I was a new student and I needed work, so it all kind of worked out for us. But the raft at that time was really, it was really sad. Not having done any work in the field and really not being, even as a volunteer, I really wasn't involved in anything like that. There were times like we had 10 beds, we had a drop-in center, and we had all these youth that were coming in. We were constantly full. We were well over 10 beds. We were putting cots and things all over the place, and we had no money. So just one story that sticks out to me, we had this group of church ladies that would come in, and on Wednesday they would bring me bags of milk, like those like bags with 3 bags in it, and that would be, they'd bring 4 of those, and that would be our milk for the week. And so we would dole out the milk to the youth because we just couldn't afford to buy any more. And then God help us if someone pregnant came in, and then we just sort of had to give her the milk, and then we just didn't have milk. So it was a really difficult time, and it's amazing to see where we've come to in actually such a short time, because that really was the response to youth homelessness that my community felt was proper, right? That was fine. People knew about us. It wasn't like we were in the shadows. Like, people knew about us. Our government knew about us. Our municipality knew about us, and they felt that was fine. So anyways, that was 2006. We ended up buying a new building because, like I was saying, we were always full. So we were sitting at 10. We went up to a building with 24 beds, much better building. Actually, it had been purpose-built as a domestic violence shelter. So it was beautiful. I mean, I pinch myself. I still pinch myself every day we walk into this building just because it's so wonderful compared to where we were. As a side note, when we moved out of that building, the first building, they tore it down because it was uninhabitable. So, I think it's really shocking just what we allow to happen in our communities, even in our services, and just how some stuff's just ridiculous. Anyways, we moved into this shelter, 24 beds. The nice thing was, because it was purpose-built, we literally, everyone grabbed their belongings. We walked 2 blocks to the new shelter, and we started that day. There was no disconnection service. It was literally, we just walked in, opened the beds, and started again. Now, what had happened is instantly we went from being full at 10 beds to being full at 24 beds. And we'd just done this whole campaign. I actually purchased a building before I purchased a house, which was interesting. And so we were sort of trying to figure things out, and suddenly I'm full again. So the whole problem, I thought this was the solution to my problem, was more beds. Right? That's kind of, it kind of makes sense. If you have 10 and you need more, you build more. But then what happened is you just need more beds. And so when I look at the scope of things, in St. Catharines, we had 24 beds. In Hamilton, we had 50 beds. And in Toronto, we had 100 beds. And you can sort of see the progression, right? As we moved up the ladder and got more population, we just added more beds. And luckily for me, in a way, is I couldn't afford to build more beds. So I was really stuck looking at another option. And prevention ended up being the option, not because it was the obvious option, although I'd like to think maybe it should have been, but it wasn't. The option, and the way everyone else, when I spoke to people, was you just added more beds. So we couldn't do that, so we had to look somewhere else. And so, and another thing, just because Housing First is quite popular now, it wasn't that we had any trouble housing youth in our shelter. It wasn't like we were plugged and we just couldn't get people out of our shelter. As fast as we could get people out of our shelter into housing, new people would come back into our shelter. So it wasn't that I needed to, it just created more churn the faster I get people out. I still had full beds. As long as those beds were there, they were full. And so we really started looking out, and at the time, serendipity happens, the community happened, there's a bit more of a mobilization in the communities were happening, people were thinking about it a bit more, and as luck would happen, a shelter closed in Niagara Falls. That was a youth shelter, and that had been supported by a small community in Niagara called Fort Erie, and some of the money Fort Erie, the municipality, was paying to Niagara Falls, this shelter, in order to house some of its youth, and because they were closed, they had a little bit of money, and they were thinking about building a shelter, or doing something. So anyways, that's how I got involved in Fort Erie, which is a rural community. The option on the table when I got to the meeting was that there was another shelter that was suggesting that we'd use the money that had become available to taxi kids back and forth between the small town and the city until the money ran out. So that was so nice. We ended up not going with that, thankfully. But that was a legitimate option on the table. Like, it was written up and it was being considered. It wasn't something like, right? It's crazy what happens when you let adults make decisions. So that was going on. But the big thing was, and I mean, again, I think maybe some of the benefit was the fact that I was extremely inexperienced and I had no past history working in the field, is that instead of just knowing what to do, I didn't know it, so I just asked the people so it occurred to me I should ask the people using our service what they wanted and why they were coming to me. And so a couple things came out of that. One was that they were all students, almost exclusively. Like well over 90% of the youth staying in my shelter had been in school almost immediately prior to them becoming homeless. We also had an assumption that the shelter was servicing the St. Catharines community, like the city, but in fact, more than half of the youth using my shelter were actually from rural communities. And the ones that were from rural communities, by the time they reached my shelter, were much, much, much worse off than the kids and the students who were in the city who directly came in. And one of the things that's kind of funny, if there's any funniness in any of this, is that when we asked them, like especially the rural youth, well, why didn't you just come to us? And they would say, well, you're a homeless service, and I'm not homeless. I'm just not at home. And so that whole identity thing, and I mean, personally, one of the biggest things I've taken from this conference right now was the work on identity, and when do people take on, and when do young people stop being whatever wonderful thing they are, and then take on this identity of homelessness, and then live that experience. And so clearly when they came to me at day one in the shelter, they weren't homeless youth yet. So at some point, I'm complicit in creating homelessness by running a shelter. So, and another thing about the shelter, woo, yeah, I was doing such a good job. And one thing, just personal belief, and something that kind of I really feel I try to put into my work. And what I saw in the shelter system, as soon as you came into the shelter system, the way it was designed when I started running, was that you no longer were able to be a young person. You were no longer allowed to be a student. You had to become an adult because there were just no supports for you to be young anymore. And by young, I'm not talking about an age. I'm talking about a development, a stage of development, a place that you are before you're an adult, however you define that. And so really what the shelter system was creating was imperfect adults instead of perfect young people, which is what they were. So by by cutting them off, we just created imperfect adults, and then we sat back and said, well, why are they screwing up? Well, because you've taken something that was perfect and made it imperfect and then blamed them for that transition that we just forced on them. There's really no reason for it outside of a systems response to how we are addressing this thing. So I really think anything we do, we have to cherish the idea of youth and not, so I'm still guilty. I'm sure if you went on my webpage, I'm sure there's some BS there about steps to independence or transitions to adulthood or whatever else we tell the funder because that's what they want to hear in order to give us the money that allows us to do the work we do. But really, I think we need to clean up our language. We really need to clean up our language. It's not about making imperfect adults. It's about allowing youth to be youthful because we value that experience. As working in the youth sector, that is what we should all value personally. That's just what I think. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm trying to kind of. So, anyways, so we had this response. All this stuff was going on. We started asking the students and the youth that were coming in why they were coming to us. And I guess when I first met Steve, this is when when I give my first sort of presentations back, a decade ago now. I was talking about how upset I was because the youth that were coming in from the rural communities, they wouldn't, like I was saying, they wouldn't come directly to me because they didn't identify as homelessness, and I was saying I'm a homeless source, they wouldn't come to me. And I would challenge anyone, if you'd like, you could go to the local bus terminal and just sit in the bus terminal, and even if you've had no experience whatsoever as an exploiter of children, you can sit there and see who's stepping off out-of-town buses who have never been to the city before. With absolutely no experience, you could all do this. And so there are people who sit in these bus terminals and wait for the kids to show up. They're very valuable commodities to drug dealers and pimps and gangs. And they go to bus terminals and literally wait for these kids to come off the buses. And the funny thing is they do the same damn thing that I do. So they offer them a place to stay. They offer them something to eat. They offer them small jobs. They offer them community. And they have outreach, and I didn't. So I had to wait for them to come to me. They would go to the bus terminal. And actually, in one really perverted thing, we had a gang that was actually enrolling kids in school in order to recruit and sell drugs through the school system. So not only, they were actually enrolling kids in school. So it's absolutely a perverted system. And then what would happen is once they cease to be valuable, because now they're known to police, they were too addicted to work anymore, what have you, they were just so broken that they were ceased to be valuable, then they would show up at my door. And that's where so much more work had to happen when the only thing that was a problem was the fact that there was a trouble at home. And I mean, obviously it's not only, but when you compound it with some of the stuff that's happening on the street, it would have been so much easier for us had we been able to intercede at that point with the family as opposed to interceding after all this victimization had happened, simply because we designed a system that forced kids to have to leave home in order to access it. So that's really how we started working in schools, because we identified that schools were a place. Almost all of the youth who were coming in our program were students. And so we started working with the schools. In Fort Erie, we piloted it, Youth Reconnect. We set a target of working with 60 youth in the first year. At that time, it was mostly teacher referrals. And now we've kind of advanced. That was at the beginning, that was 2008. Now it's 2018. And we're working with Raise and Roof to launch Upstream. And one of the things that, just a quick note on that, one of the things that teachers, the flaw in our system, is that teachers can only really identify students in need because there's a change in grade, a change in behavior, or a change in attitude. And so the Australians who have done this work on it found that only 50% of the time is that true. So there's 50% of the students we're not actually reaching because the method we're currently using fails to identify them. So Upstream, the screener, the population screener, allows us to find 100% of the youth. So I'm really hopeful that as we roll this out, we'll actually be able to reduce our numbers even further with Youth Reconnect. But Youth Reconnect is actually a fairly simple and the thing is, the common sense thing isn't common, right? We need simple answers are the best answers. Working with the existing groups that should be working with youth is the answer. Schools, families, the people that, they're in our communities, we're just not accessing them and they're not orientated correctly to work with the homeless population is really the problem. So that's where we as leaders need to address that and show the way. And you know what, people are willing. It isn't like teachers wanted to force their students and make them drop out. They wanted to help them, but they couldn't get beyond their doors because once the student left the school and left the community, they didn't have any ability to bring them back. And so that's where the community and the school is such a powerful tool to keeping students in school. And that's really what we did. It's just a teacher would identify or a student would identify. We'd go out to the community, meet them there, and then that way they can remain students while we're working through the housing. So it might be some family mediation. It could go all the way up to independent housing or finding you housing even in a different community, although our goal is to try and allow you to stay in your home community so that you have natural supports and peer groups. And we were really successful. We have about an 85% success rate with our youth who intake with us, that they stay in their home community and housed, that they never become homeless. And about a 70 to a 75% success rate in maintaining education over that time. So that's been a huge success for us. We're extremely happy because, I mean, it's also poverty, right? All these things compound, right? That's why the school system's so beautiful as a way to, because you can sort of hit so many different factors in one intervention. So if you drop out of school, we know you're more likely to live in poverty. We also know that you're more likely to be chronically homeless. When I did some research on chronic homeless adults, we found the two things were statistically true: dropped out of school and first-time homeless as a teen. So, I mean, we know where our chronically homeless adults are coming from. And so if we can do that intervention then, I think it's critical. Schools are the right place, especially in rural communities, because every community has a school, right? And so that way we don't need to build rafts everywhere. So it's really cost-effective intervention also that can service large geographies, but links to existing services like my shelter in the city, so that if you're absolutely that homeless at at 3 o'clock at the end of your school day, if you're in Fort Erie and you're absolutely homeless, my worker will take you in or we'll tax you into the city. So you just have a place to stay, but then it's rapid rehousing for your community so that you never have a school interruption or have to live on the street during that time. And so for impact, because I'm doing this for a decade, and I'm telling you, I'm not seeing a lot of movement on the whole prevention thing. Right? I've been talking. I think I've been convincing. People nod. Sometimes people clap. And I'm not seeing the movement I thought I would see already. And so I don't know exactly what I'm not doing right. But if it's stats you want, we started this program 2008. We had about 500 students, youth, come through our shelter that year. In 2016, we had 126. So that's a 70% reduction in homelessness in our community. And not only that, there's 2 shelters in Niagara. There's ours, and there's another one in Niagara Falls. And so I had the region, because we have to report our beds, like everyone who stays, to our region. So they have all the data for the whole system. And I said, because like I said, I really want to know if the data is true. So I said, pull our numbers. And that's how I ended up getting this stuff. They pulled all the numbers on our usage and reporting to them. And you see this chart, there's this graph that goes down from those numbers. And then the other shelter's slightly smaller than us, so they pulled those numbers. It was interesting. So it started off on the same directory, moving down, and then it started going up over the last couple of years. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. Maybe I'm manipulating my numbers. It happens. So I said, well, what's the cause of that? Now, the interesting piece, their age range is actually 16 to 30 because there's no adult shelter, male shelter in their community. So they sort of pick up some of the slack by increasing the age range. So I asked them to isolate just the ages 16 to 24, which is the age range that we're sort of focused on. And when they did that, the pattern exactly followed us. So basically what's happened is the youth shelter is now becoming an adult shelter, and so they're actually filling up their beds now, where before they were actually at capacity because they were just working with youth, but as the youth stopped using the beds, the adults have now started filling those beds, and actually they're now moving upwards in bed usage. So this absolutely works. And there's a bunch of other programs. You can go on my website, call me if you want. We have tons of stuff we can do. And I mean, there's real movement in the community. The Away Home, COH, Raising the Roof, the Alliance. Things are happening, but it can't just happen up here where we talk a lot, and it can't just be it just can't be adults talking about it. It has to happen at the grassroots level, and that'll force the services to provide you the service you need. Don't wait for us to decide, because like I said, we're all experts, so we know nothing. So it's really you that know what you need. So I would encourage you to just do the thing, not ask for the thing. And please don't allow us to steal youth voices. You need to have your own authentic voices and speak to us, because we won't ask. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. Do we have time for questions? Does anybody have a question? We will take a question. Yes, sir. I think we have a mic.
Let's all of the panelists speculate about the reasons for what Mike said. We've known about this for so long, and there hasn't been much uptake. Could each of the panelists give their ideas about why there hasn't been a shift away from managing the problem towards preventing the problem?
It's a hell of a lot of investment in the status quo. And I think, Steve always says, I like this, he says, as much as people want change, the work that they would have to do to get there, it's too difficult for them. And so we have to show people what it looks like, help people through the change management, the difficulty. We also have to give permission to fail, and we don't have systems oriented to allow people to try and fail in making that transition to prevention. So I think we need to create a more enabling environment for that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, we've created, people don't like the language of an industry, but it is, right? And it's conservative and in some ways self-serving, regardless of how well-meaning it is. I'm not criticizing the work people do, but there is resistance. We haven't had governments that have supported that shift to prevention, but it's coming. And the other thing is, a lot of the ideas that drive like the more progressive side of our responses to homelessness want to just focus on chronically homeless people, right? And to me, that's upside down. And so those are some of the things I think we need to change. But even though we've been stuck, one of the things that we know, and your story is a good one, you can go from being stuck to being innovative really fast. And so I think things are aligning very well. I know in Calgary you've been doing lots of really good work on prevention and change your whole approach, that kind of thing. We can do this, right? And everyone here is going to need to be responsible. The session we're doing this afternoon, it's like we need to identify what we can do, how we can push up to encourage and support other orders of government to align what they do to support a shift.
Echoing what has been said, and I'll specifically add that the system that we have currently, provides jobs, and there are job descriptions and way of working. This is like, shifting the approach is scary because it changes people's jobs and who like people like income security, definitely. So we can grow attached to a system that doesn't serve youth, right? But that responds to funding requirements. Like I found a lot of our system is driven to answer to the funder, not to the youth. And shifting that is difficult because money's involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we incentivize chronic homelessness. And one of the difficulties we didn't have a lot of time. One of the things when those numbers started to drop, actually that created a real danger to my agency because we were paid by our beds. So when I got to 50% bed, I actually started not being able to afford to run my shelter anymore. So we made it through, but it was a tough year. We ran a deficit. My board was not happy in that way because financially they saw the agency failing. But we were succeeding but failing at the same time. So I could understand how that would be, for an agency to take it on, and then it's not like our lives aren't already busy enough to then shoot yourself in the process wasn't the most comfortable thing. But once we got through that and we thought differently, we survived. But I can see how that was a real barrier to moving to prevention.
We have limited time, but we have one question, so more question.
So, like, one thing that's kind of like being homeless for a while now and things like that, and the one word that stick out to me all the time is the word independence, and I just want to pry more into it and kind of just maybe explore that word, because like to me it kind of brings images of like being alone and being like, you know, figuring yourself out. But it's kind of funny because throughout the history of mankind and throughout human beings and throughout the history of everything, even businesses and whatever, we're not truly independent, are we? Because like we still need other people. Because I looked up the dictionary just to make sure I'm right about the definition of independence. It says it's being independent of support of others and blah 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 blah. But really, like, if you think about it, like, I'm gonna go philosophical here, like, we're not in a vacuum. Last time I checked, like, you know, we need the sun, we need everything. So, should we redefine the definition of independence? Should we change the language when we say steps to independence? Because to me, it's a bit of a heavy word. I don't know, thoughts just to open it up. Thank you.
Do you want to go first? I agree completely with you, and that's why I think some of the outcomes that we're, you know, in the best case scenario when we're working on homelessness have to be rethought, right? Like just getting you into housing and independent is not a good enough goal. And you mentioned it, and you know, like within the Housing First for Youth core principles, that social inclusion piece is as important as anything. Because one of the things that I always struggle with is how, when we're talking about young people who experience homelessness, we create a whole other set of expectations that we would never apply. You know, I'm old enough to have children who went through teen would never apply to my own children. And I would never want it to apply to me. So the things like you say, like the rush to adulthood, you know, like all young people are going to transition to adulthood, but why don't we build a system around helping young people get, you know, with social inclusion, family and natural support, stay connected to community, stay connected to school, and give them time, right? Give them time to grow up in ways that allow them to stay young and enjoy and experience that, but not have to fear losing their housing or have conditions, I can only have housing if I do such and such, right? That's where we need to go. It's about social inclusion, not about creating independent, you know.
Exactly. And I always say that the term independence is kind of code for not my fucking problem anymore. Yeah, so completely agree. And we're very careful to not use that language. Mike was
But we
talking
will
about
swear.
how, yeah, exactly. A great role model. But, you know, Mike was talking about how we all need to really dig deep into the language that we use and really question that. And I think that youth voice is going to be critical in helping us do that deep work.
So keep going philosophical.
And I just like to prove the point that you're absolutely right. We're wrong. You make the right point, but the dictionary might say something different, right? It's a society. I mean, I think I have a degree also in history, so I think this whole independence question is really born of our belief in liberalism, which, you know, we developed in order to stop clans and religions from fighting back in the, you know, the Renaissance. But and that's part of the problem I'm seeing as a social service provider, is that I work in a liberal society, and I'm a liberal, like at least small L, and that I believe in individual rights, and I mean it's been a very strong way for people to interact in creating a fair and just society. However, what liberalism does do is it removes family and community from the equation. And so that becomes a real, and personally I find this struggle daily in the work we're doing, especially as we move more towards, because back when I was, you know, 10 years ago, if you came to the shelter, we didn't ask about your family.
Yep.
Like, you were an individual, and in fact we not only that, but we hyper enforced it, in that, you know, you shouldn't talk to your family. We won't even tell them anything. We still don't. I mean, there's privacy laws, but, you know, like, we just wouldn't communicate, and it's like we just said, well, all that stuff, all your community doesn't matter. All that matters is what you want. But we never thought to ask about community because it was just not a part of that rights language, and that's how we behave as rights-bearing citizens. So, so some way liberalism is getting away in the idea of community, because community and liberalism have a tough time, and families an individual is interesting. One thing I found in Upstream, we asked this one question. It's question 7D, and it says, "Are you safe at home?" And we thought, and so what we do is any youth, we run this screener a couple times now in schools. Anytime any student asks that on the screener day, we meet with them that day. So if they answer anything other than yes, are you safe at home, we meet with you that day to see, to make sure you're safe. And so I'm sure probably most of the room is thinking is, physical abuse. And actually that isn't really what students are answering when they answer that question. When we actually spoke to them, what they were saying to us is they don't make a distinction between I and family. So when they were telling us about not being safe at home, there was something like there was food insecurity, there was an employment insecurity, something like that had happened, like something was happening to the family. And they internalized that as I. So there was no difference between the group, the community, and the individual. It's only, and the thing is, as adults, I couldn't understand it anymore because it's been so long since I saw anything other than I as an individual. Like I'd lost that ability to understand family as I. But that's really how they're seeing it. So how can I design a program and I can't even see the problem? So I think that's exactly the point. Interpence is a BS word.
We don't have time for a quick little direct question. Absolutely.
Well, it's good to see there's more interest, and there'll be more opportunities for discussion and chatting throughout the workshops and sessions for the rest of the day and at lunchtime. So thanks so much for your attention, and thank you to our fantastic panel.
everybody. Oh, sorry if that's really loud. We're going to go ahead and get started. I have my colleagues here, but we're from Washington, D.C., and we're going to do a quick sort of case study on our experience with coordinated entry. But I thought before we got started there, it might be helpful to kind of like describe a little bit of background from Washington, D.C. and about our specific roles, because I think that might be helpful context. So my name is Eileen Krasner. I am the Coordinated Entry System Administrator for the District of Columbia, or Washington, D.C. So I oversee youth, families, adults, and veteran coordinated entry system implementation, but this one is obviously focused just on our experience with youth coordinated entry, because it is a very sort of separate and unique experience with regards to the implementation. So I work for a nonprofit called the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, which is a really long name, so we just say TCP, but we are a contractor of both the local government in DC as well as the federal government. So we act as the COC collaborative applicant for the renewal of federal funding every year, and that includes the administration of HMIS or Service Point, whatever database you might use, as well as coordinated entry. So a lot of communities, especially in the US, do not have a funded position like mine, but that means that we have sort of a dedicated team to coordinated entry. I'm also joined by Tamara Mooney, who is a program analyst with the DC Department of Human Services, so one of our funders, right? And they are the largest agency to kind of provide both direct and sub-grant sort of services for homeless youth, and they've been instrumental in kind of growing that capacity in the district, as well as helping us lead some of those strategic decisions. So she'll chime in along the way just to make sure that I'm on track, and anything else that I leave out from the government perspective. I think one other thing before I get started is just that I've learned so much here so far about the Canadian perspective on the whole, but also in Ottawa specifically. So I have like a fire burning now with the prevention perspective, right? We've been focused primarily on building our programs and making sure that they're doing a good job. And I think Mike said it really well by saying that like you can't start prevention when you're not like when you're trying to focus on, or you shouldn't wait to start prevention until